right, so we have been playing d4 pretty religiously over the past couple of games, and we're going to continue that today. We're going to start with d4, and we're going to play a Queen's Gambit decline. Queen's Gambit, I mean. Maybe our opponent will decline it, yes. So he declines it with the move c6. This is the Slav. I don't think we faced the Slav, or maybe we faced it once. The Slav is it's part of the big three. The big three is, of course, the Queen's Gambit accepted, the Queen's Gambit declined, and the Slav. These are the three most reputable moves in this position. The three most reputable responses to the Queen's Gambit. So after c6, of course we could play c takes d5. That's the exchange Slav. But the exchange Slav is extremely colorless. Unless you play a very interesting variation that the vast majority of people are unfamiliar with. I am going to introduce you to this variation. Now, we can play this through the move order c takes d5, or we can play this through the move order knight c3. And that is the Boor variation. Let's take on d5. This is sort of the pure way of reaching this position. Now we play the move knight c3. And whether or not we can play this line hinges on black playing the main move, which is knight f6. If black plays knight c6, we have a second idea that is also very dangerous that I will also introduce to you. So either way, we're going to get a good position here. I can sense it. So this is the exchange Slav. If you follow the mainline theory, then the exchange Slav results in a very colorless position. A lot of prearranged draws are made with the exchange Slav. So for instance, if you play the move knight f3 and black plays knight c6, you basically get a completely symmetrical position that ends in a draw like 75% of the time. But recently, in the last 10 years or so, people have started playing the exchange Slav for a win. And the line that I'm about to show you has been around, I think, for over 20 years. It's been around for decades. It's informally named after Carl Brandon Boor, who is a FIDE master. I think he's from Ohio. He has championed this line. He's written about it. He's played it. And I think he deserves the namesake of this line. And it is the move f2, f3 in this position. Now, if you're seeing this for the first time, then you should feel that this move is crazy. It violates essentially all principles of development, violates Ben Finegold's golden rule. What the heck are we doing with the move f3? But that's exactly why I think this move contains so much venom. People don't realize how dangerous black's position can get and how fast it can get dangerous. I had a couple of students who have played this move very successfully. Black has a clear way of equalizing. Black has actually several ways of equalizing. But the vast majority of people, I would say below 2200, and in my experience, even players rated 2000, often get completely lost in the complications here. So what is the idea of the move f3? Well, the idea should be completely obvious to you. The idea is to occupy the center with e2, e4. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Now, the majority of people here with black play the move knight c6. And knight c6 is not necessarily a bad move, but it really allows us to execute and carry out the main gist of the idea of f3. Is this played at the highest level? Well, not really, and that is because most people at a high level actually know how to neutralize the move f3, and I will show you how to neutralize f3 after the game, assuming that black doesn't play the move, the critical move in this position. So it's not bishop f5 here. And I will preface this by saying that I'm not a specialist in the Boor. I know like the basics of it, but it's entirely possible that our opponent will make a move here that I don't know. So if you're watching this, let's say on YouTube, don't get too angry if I don't know the move or if I actually go wrong here. It's possible. Knight c6. Okay, so we ignore this move and we continue with our plan. We play the move e4, e2, e4. And here we start to understand the main idea of the system. It may seem that d takes e4 wins a pawn. You might look at this and say, okay, d takes e4, f takes e4. Black has two attackers on the d4 pawn. White has only one defender. So queen takes d4 essentially wins a center pawn and offers a queen trade. What's good about that? Well, the point is that after d takes e4, you play the move d5. This intermezzo is missed by a lot of players, and it leads to a very, very dangerous position for black. So we play d5. We force the knight off of c6. Then and only then do we recapture on e4, getting ourselves a major pawn mass in the center. But all of that is moot because black has played the move e5. So already I don't know this move. I don't know e5, which I think means that it's not the correct move, but we're going to have to think on our feet here. Okay, so let's reason logically. Well, it seems to me that white's choices here are really only limited to one move. It doesn't make much sense for us to take on d5. If we play e takes d5, at the very least, black can take the pawn on d4, establishing a knight in the center. So I think the only reasonable move here is to start with d takes e5. I think that, yeah, bishop b5 is also possible, but bishop b5 seems like an unnecessary way to overextend ourselves. Like bishop b5, e takes d4, and then play queen takes d4 seems quite awkward. Just no need for that when I think we just clarify the tension with de. Okay, and this is a critical moment. Let's spend some quality time making sure that we at least do our best to find the best move here. So there's a couple of candidate moves here that jump out immediately. The most obvious move is e takes d5. That wins a pawn in the center. Now, the drawback of e takes d5 is that our development isn't great. That is the main flaw of the Boor system, is that you play the move f3. So after e takes d5, what I'm concerned about is black playing the move bishop c5, developing the bishop to a really nice square, preventing us from castling, and just in general, preventing us from developing freely. So we should put e takes d5 aside as a possibility, and we should consider the other candidate moves. Now, noticing this configuration of knights should lead you to a very typical kind of idea in such positions. And this is a universal idea across all openings. That is to play f4, chase one knight away, and when that knight moves away, to drive the wedge into black's position, e4, e5, chasing the other knight away, and creating this pawn chain in the center. That, to me, looks a lot more appealing than taking on d5. So I actually think f4 is the correct move. Now, you might wonder, well, why don't we do the same thing while developing our bishop, right? Shouldn't we develop while doing the same thing? But it's not the same thing, because after bishop f4, if the knight drops back to g6, the bishop on f4 is going to be hanging. But doing stuff with the pawn is generally going to be safer. Let's go with f4. I'm pretty confident that this is the best move. Probably means it's wrong, but at least it makes logical sense, right? Rawr. And now Ben Finegold can breathe easy because we no longer have a pawn on f3. Well, f4 bishop g4 is not dangerous. That's just one move-itis, right? Bishop g4 simply creates a one-move threat against the queen. We have a million ways to parry that threat. We can play queen b3 or queen a4 check. So bishop g4 is not scary. Okay. So let's pause here for a second just to reconsider. Okay, we can play also e takes d5. The fact that he has gone knight c6 has increased the appeal of taking on d5, because now this move comes with tempo. So what happens after e takes d5? Well, probably black is going to play knight b4. But there I see another interesting type of option. Let's reflect on that position just for a second. I actually have to think about it, because there's a lot of complication hiding beneath the surface. So what I see in that position is a way to trade queens by force. But even after a queen trade, our king is potentially a sitting duck on e1. Ooh. So as one of you indicated, the main deterrent to playing the move e5 is the counter-attacking move d4. So after e5, d4, what happens there? Well, we probably are going to take the knight on f6. Black is going to take the knight on c3. We will trade queens. Queen takes d8 check. Let's say black plays knight takes d8. And there, we play the move b takes c3. Black probably plays g takes f6. Hopefully you're following this line. And by the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can pause at this point, set it up on a board, and make these moves as I say them if you want to follow in real time. So once again, e5, d4, takes, queen takes d8, knight takes d8, b takes c3, g takes f6. How do we evaluate that resulting endgame? Where, well, both sides have a deficiency in terms of their pawn structure. But black's kingside pawns are, I would say, worse then our queenside pawns. The other good thing about white's position is that we have a small initiative. We can quickly get our bishop to b5 with check, and it seems easier for us to castle than for black to castle. So I actually think that e5 is the wisest continuation. And after the game, I'll spell out some of my thoughts about e takes d5. Maybe the engine wants to be greedy here, entirely possible, but I think we should be principled and stick to our initial idea with e5. Okay, you're welcome to follow with an engine and laugh at me, but that violates the entire zen of the speedrun, right? If it's news to you that I'm much worse than the computer, then, you know, then you've been living under a bit of a rock. Yeah, I think he takes d5 and bishop c4 might have been a lot better. Somehow, I just don't want to be greedy. Somehow I want to be principled in the center. Yeah, we'll analyze after the game. So, we considered the move d4. Of course, black can also move the knight. Where can he move it? Well, he or she can move it to e4. But in that case, I thought that we also get a better endgame. After knight e4, we probably want to refrain from taking on d5 because we've got nothing developed, and black has this nasty possibility of queen h4 check. That just seems no good. But after knight e4, we can play knight takes e4, d takes e4, and again we trade on d8. And in the resulting position, black has a serious pawn weakness on e4, which I think we can attack by bringing, for example, our knight to c3 or to g3. I think white's better in the endgame. So what else can black do here? Well, black can play knight g4. But after knight g4, I think we can already take the pawn with our queen. Queen takes d5. So I actually don't, and maybe this is -2, but I don't see off the top of my head what it is that's so scary about this position for white. Black has a lead in development, so maybe there is some crazy idea that involves leaving the knight on f6 and playing a move like bishop c5, accelerating the development. Maybe that's the way, but knight g4 is on the board. Okay, so, well, I think that I actually am beginning to see why we might be in trouble here. What I underestimated is that after queen takes d5, black has this weird looking move, queen b6. And all of a sudden, our queen is left stranded in the center, and black is threatening a devastating check on f2. So I just feel like black gets the pieces out so quickly in that position. So I think we need to amend our strategy a little bit, and we need to try to develop our pieces at all costs. We need to try to accelerate our development before we start worrying about the d5 pawn. How can we supercharge our development in this position? Well, what that essentially is asking is, can we develop with tempo? Can we develop a piece while simultaneously attacking one of our opponent's pieces? Well, we can. We can play bishop e2. The crazy thing is that bishop e2 doesn't actually carry a threat, because even if we take on g4, black can respond with queen h4 check, forking the king and the bishop. But that leads to a queen trade, and that in the event of that happening, we play g3, black plays queen takes g4, and all things held equal, a queen trade should be in white's favor. White should benefit in the event of a queen trade because we are behind in development. On the other hand, giving up our light squared bishop is potentially problematic given how many weak light squares we have in our position. So let's start by waiting for black's response. The move I am most worried about, this is a very advanced move. I don't expect him to play it. That is the move bishop f8 to c5, because he basically has to sense that bishop takes g4 meets with queen h4 check and realize that he can just continue developing as if nothing is the matter. Bishop c5 is very, very dangerous, and we'll figure out what... Okay, great. All right. Well, let's think. Maybe we'll just get crushed here. Okay, I have an idea. So just to spell out why bishop takes g4 is bad, is so unappetizing. If you can follow along, bishop takes g4, queen h4 check, g3, queen takes g4. And the problem is that if we trade queens in that position, yes, the queens are off the board, but our king is still devastatingly weak. And black can try to swing this knight into d4. There's just way too many threats there, and I don't think we get a chance to complete our development. So I actually think that the best move for white here might be queen takes d5. I think queen takes d5 is the trickiest move we can play in this position. So what does this move do? Well, obviously we're taking a pawn, which is good. We are attacking the bishop. And what I'm relying on is that after queen takes d5, knight takes d5, we're also threatening a fork on c7. So you might notice here that black has the possibility of knight f2. If black plays knight f2 in this position, that's just bad because we can take the bishop and then we can trap the knight on h1. If black plays queen takes d5 first and then knight f2, we both essentially take each other's rooks, and then we both try to get our knights out of the corner. Bishop f2 check. I was not expecting that move. Bishop f2 check. Okay, well, I will bite and go king f1. And we are pretty close to getting mated here, but I think the king is safe for the time being. I think white is safe here. I think bishop f2 might have been a mistake, unless there's some ridiculous follow-up here, like knight e3 check, I don't know. But knight e3 check we can already take on e3 and trade queens. White is probably still worse, but is defensible. Yeah, I don't know what the follow-up is here. Let's see. And the other problem of putting minor pieces in such close proximity to the king is that obviously there's now contact between the king and the bishop, which means that bishop takes g4 has become a serious threat. The bishop on f2 is a type 2 undefended piece. It's only defended by one other piece, and that piece is also under fire. Okay? The bishop f2 check, I think, is a mistake, unless there is some sort of crazy follow-up here that I don't see. Well, queen h4 is possible. Yeah, queen h4 is possible, but then we can develop our knight with tempo with knight f3. Type 1 undefended piece is a piece that is undefended by any other pieces or pawns. So technically, the rook on a1 is the type 1 undefended piece. Now, that's totally irrelevant because the rook cannot be attacked. Okay, queen b6 might be best. Yeah, queen b6 might be best. Yeah, queen b6 probably is best. Ooh, that's a strong move. Man, you guys are good. Queen b6 is super strong because it protects the bishop and it builds a battery which threatens bishop takes g1 and queen f2. Now, I think after queen b6, we will have to find a way to defend the f2 square with another piece. But let's cross that bridge when we get there. Our opponent's already getting really low on time, which is good. I think we will be able to survive this. Queen b6 on the board. Wow, okay. Well, I think we have to go knight h3. I don't see another move. We develop the knight, but most importantly, we defend the f2 square, taking the sting out of any bishop move that black could come up with here. So I guess the opening experiment has misfired dreadfully. Yeah, so f4, e5 was bad intuition by me. This was just bad intuition. I assumed that this would be strong, but I completely underestimated how much we're weakening our king and how much the lack of our development impacts the evaluation. To be honest, knight g4, I just missed knight g4. Like, the only two moves I considered here, and I'll talk about this more after the game, were d4 and knight e4. And both of these moves allow a queen trade. Knight g4 kind of keeps the queens on the board and gives black attacking chances. But okay, the game is not over. We continue to defend. We continue to milk black's clock down. Knight e3 check. Well, we have no choice. We have to take. We have to take. Bishop takes e3. Now we have to continue being very precise. So, to survive these types of positions, it's important not to get overwhelmed. It's important to understand what the priorities are, because you will not be able to attend to every need in your position, right? Pardon my French, shit's bad, right? Your position's going to be unpleasant regardless. You need to figure out what the most important things are. There's two things in particular that you need to pay attention to. The first is what the immediate threats are. Are there immediate threats here? Does black have something that is going to win the game if they play it? Well, there is, right? If you look carefully, you'll notice that queen takes b2 is a really, really bad move to allow because it forks the rook and the knight. So that's number one. Number two is to figure out whether we have any ways that we can orchestrate counterplay, right? Whether we can get active, whether we can create counter threats that might serve to deflect our opponent's attention from essentially the side where he's attacking. And if you ask yourself that question, I think you immediately see an interesting idea, which is to play the move knight g5 and create a threat against the f7 pawn. What does that move do? Well, it threatens f7. I guess what I'm asking is, why is that a dangerous threat? Well, it's a dangerous threat because f7 isn't that easy to protect. And you could say, well, can't black just castle here? But if black castles, then the h7 pawn becomes weak, and we can drop our queen down to d3, attacking h7, threatening mate in 1. The other thing that queen d3 does is it vacates the d5 square for the knight, and knight d5 is going to be a fork against the black queen and the bishop. That essentially is what my idea is in this position with knight g5. But that's not the end of the line. If you can follow again, bit of a long line, castle's kingside, queen d3, g6, knight d5, black has queen takes b2, counter-attacking the rook on a1. What is the move in that position, ladies and gentlemen? After queen takes b2, white has a key move without which the whole line fails, and we might actually get that. Rook b1. We play rook a1 to b1, attacking the queen. The bishop is still hanging. I think we can safely play queen d3. Now, perhaps queen e4 is more accurate. I don't see a difference off the top of my head. Let's go with my initial idea with queen d3. We'll have to compare after the game. But a very important move to see, queen d3, right? How do you see this move? Well, essentially the first thought that I had, right, is that the queen has essentially done its job, right? The queen in the center is poorly placed, so my inclination is always to move the queen away from the most vulnerable square. Let's go with knight d5. I think our opponent is relying on queen takes b2. Notice also that there is a potential check on f6. This is not that dangerous for black at the moment because there's just king g7. But just a mental note to make to yourself. Well, if rook d8 here, then at a minimum, we can take black's queen, black takes our queen, and then we can actually take either of the two rooks, and we have a big material advantage as a result. And I think we are officially out of the woods. Yeah, knight d5. I think queen takes b2 is going to happen, and then we're going to play rook b1. And after rook b1, queen takes a2. With what piece should we capture the bishop on e3? Let's test your visualization. The queen or the knight? The knight, exactly, because the white queen is still going to be making contact with the rook. We cannot abandon the black queen, we cannot abandon the rook with our queen. So we take back with the knight. Even though it's a retreating move, we have to keep our queen in defense of the rook on b1. Well, yeah, to stop queen takes b5. King's Gambit asks, what about queen takes b2, rook b1, bishop f5? Well, the simplest there would have just been to take black's queen and then to take black's bishop. Bishop f5 is desperation. Let's keep it simple here, right? You might start calculating knight takes b6, bishop takes d3, knight takes a8. It gets complicated there. Bishop takes e2 and bishop takes f4, and black could end up only being down in exchange. There's a much simpler move. Just take the damn bishop. You don't have to calculate anything or of a piece. Now, I briefly asked myself the question, can we move the queen away with check? The answer is obviously no, but that should be your first instinct in a situation where both queens are hanging. You should go down a clear list. The first question, can I move my queen away with check? Can I move my queen away with a mate threat? So if the h3 square were accessible, or if the h4 square were accessible, queen h4 would essentially win the queen here. Once you answer no to those questions, then you start looking for desperados, moving the queen away with tempo, moving the queen away, capturing a piece. Here, we can just take an undefended bishop. Queen takes b2. Now, the last step that we have to carry out before we win the game is we need to consolidate. Our position is still all over the place. Our king is on a vulnerable spot. Our rooks are disconnected. We need to make sure that all of our pieces are centralized, defended, and we need to repel the last stages of Black's initiative. So the nicest move here, I think, is king up to f2. Yeah, very good. Because not only does this protect the rook, it also connects the rooks. It brings the king onto a square where it's just sort of surrounded by all of these defensive pieces. Now, some of you might look at this and say, but I don't want my bishop to be pinned. But again, it's all about how many times the bishop is defended. It's defended twice. It isn't attacked a single time other than the queen. Black has no effective way to put pressure on that bishop. And if we need to, we can bring a rook to e1, either rook to e1, and protect this bishop even further. So the higher rated you get, the more you have to sort of concretize is kind of an awkward word, but I don't know how to describe this process. Essentially take general principles that 500 rating points ago, you would just sort of accept as a fact. Like, I'm not going to play king f2 because it walks into a pin. But when you're higher rated, you have to understand that not all pins are dangerous, and you have to become better at discerning which pins are dangerous and which are not. Okay. Now, I see a way for us to trade queens by force. We could have done this on the previous move. I just missed it. Let's do it here. Queen c3. Very good. Queen c3 forces the queen trade. Notice how this works. The black queen is undefended. So rook takes d5. We simply take the queen. b6 is covered by the knight. b5 is covered by the bishop. Black has to trade. We're up a piece in the endgame. That's it. And as I mentioned, I think in the previous speedrun game, this is just a GG move. You don't have to calculate anything else once you've determined that you're getting the queens off the board. Because you know that you're going to convert up a piece, and black just resigns. So a quick game, 20 moves, but a lot happened in those 20 moves. A lot happened in those 20 moves. So, all right, so the opening experiment was an abject failure. I apologize for that. I thought it would work better. Now, as far as I know, the move that most Slav players and Slav books recommend is queen b6 in this position. And the point is that e4 is met with d takes e4, f takes e4, and e5, counter-striking in the center. I think the most similar opening to this is the fantasy Caro-Kann. In fact, the crazy thing is that we might almost have a transposition to the fantasy. I mean, it's not exactly the same because in the fantasy there's a pawn on c6, but it's a very similar theme. If you consider the fantasy Caro, and what I'm talking about is the Caro-Kann opening, the fantasy variation is this very sharp move f3. So black has a line where he goes queen b6, knight c3, and e5. This is a reputable variation. It's not that good for black because after d e5, bishop c5, there's the move knight a4. Without this move, this line would work like a charm. But notice how similar this idea is. This idea of going e5 in order to weaken the b6 g1 diagonal. Sorry, I guess a7 g1 diagonal. So here it's the same concept. Queen b6, e4, takes, and e5. And the point is that if white takes on e5, there's knight g4. And white's just got a bunch of gaping holes. There's a mate threat. The bishop's coming to c5. Black gets a huge initiative. So the main line is bishop b5 check. Now I think black goes knight c6. After d5, I think black is supposed to go bishop b4 here, which leads to incredibly sharp complications. But I'm almost positive that queen b6 is the top engine move in this position. Let me pull up ChessBase just to confirm this for you. Yeah, so according to my database, before we jump the gun here, f3 was first played in the year 2000 by a guy named Kleinheinz. Boor played it in 2004, so he wasn't the first to play it. The highest rated player to play it was like 2600. Yeah, queen b6 is good. Knight c6, of course, is the most popular move. I think the line that most people tend to default to is knight c6, e4, and e6. I'll get to that in a second. I think black is worse in this position. Yeah, the top engine move is queen b6. e4, d4, f e5. Yeah, bishop b5, check, knight c6. So what I just showed you is indeed the top engine line. And if you play d takes e5, and queen b6 is almost never played. This is a very uncommon move. Most people don't know to play this. So after d5, knight g4, the engine line continues queen e2. Now black is supposed to play the weird move bishop e6. Another strange developing move. The point of this move is to take the sting out of knight d5 so that it can be met with bishop takes d5. Now there's a queen trade, queen b5 check. Black trades on his own terms. We don't take on b5, allowing white to develop the bishop. Instead, we parry it with knight c6, and you get an endgame. Queen takes b6, a takes b6, and if anything, I think black is for choice here. Knight f3, bishop c5. You can tell how nicely black has developed their pieces. White is still currently up a pawn. I think it's equal objectively, but white needs to be careful. So, yeah, bishop c5 instead of bishop e6 is possible, but here there is knight d5. Here there is knight d5. So bishop e6 is the only way to stop knight d5. So unfortunately, I'm kind of busting the bubble here in terms of the board, but hopefully not that many people will watch this video. So let's transition to the game continuation. I'm pretty sure that e5 is actually really, really interesting. I'm pretty sure that e5 is really, really interesting. So knight c6, e4. I'll show some lines here a little bit later. I want to check the engine after e5. Ooh. So, actually, I'm not that bad. This is really interesting. F4, knight c6. F4 is the second engine choice. But after knight c6, e5 is a horrible mistake. So I actually went down the right path at first. But here we're supposed to play e takes d5. And after knight b4, oh, this is what I missed. So here's what I missed. Here's what I missed. After e d5, knight b4, who can tell me what the most tempting developing move is for white? Like, what's the move that your hand is just playing automatically? Yeah, it's bishop b5 check. Black responds with bishop d7. And now the only move that I consider, queen a4 is worse. Bishop c4 is too slow because I think black has... Bishop c4, black has bishop f5. And the threat of knight c2 is very annoying. So you're probably going to end up playing bishop b5 check here anyway. You might as well do it here. After bishop d7, the only thing that I considered was queen e2 check. The idea being that bishop e7 loses to d6. The bishop is pinned. It is lost because after bishop b5, you can actually play queen takes b5, but even stronger is knight takes b5. The pawn on d6 is protected. The bishop is lost. White wins the game. But black covers with the queen. And your first instinct might be, well, great, right? This is what I mentioned. You're trading queens. Everything is awesome. But the queen trade doesn't solve white's problems. There's the threat of knight c2. There's the threat of recapturing the pawn. You have this nasty pawn on f4 that's sticking out like a sore thumb and preventing the bishop's development. It should make sense to you that black is doing fantastic here. Black is better. White's going to end up losing the pawn, and white's position just sucks. But in this position, there is a key computer move without which white is simply worse. And that is the move d6. This move escaped my mind. d6 in this position. And there's a crazy line that the engine gives, which is after bishop b5, knight b5, black has the move queen a5. Now, you might look and say, well, I don't get it. Knight c7 check and knight takes a8. But that gives black a huge initiative. So instead, you should give a check on e2. Now the line continues king d7. And now the incredibly cold-blooded knight f3. The point is to be able to meet the pin against the queen with a knight e5 check. And if black goes after the rook, if black goes knight c2 check and knight takes a1, then white orchestrates a devastating attack on black's king. So basically here you go, so knight f3, knight c2, king f1, knight takes a1. Actually, king f2 is more accurate. King f2 is more accurate to be able to involve the rook through e1. You don't want to obstruct the rook. Knight takes a1, knight e5 check. And the attack is totally and utterly devastating. For example, knight e5 check, king c8, and now the simple bishop d2 ends the game. Because the rook is coming to c1, and there are 550 different mates. For example, queen takes a2, rook c1 check, king b8, and now there's a very pretty mate in 2, knight d7 check, and queen e8 mate. If you really want to rub it in, you can even sack the rook on c8 first. Then go queen e8. So this is very one-sided. I mean, you can tell that white's just totally killing it here. So for that reason, in this position, black has to go knight d3 check. Double check. The king has to slide over, and black plays queen takes b5. And all of this line converges onto this particular resource, without which everything would fail. Who can spot white's move? Yeah, knight e5 check. Very good. The queen is undefended, which means that the knight cannot recapture. The king has to take d6. And now it is very important to avoid a couple of false positives, right? False temptations. The first is to avoid taking on d3 too quickly. If you take on d3 too quickly, you give black the e-file and you give black the initiative. If you take on f7, you might say, oh, this is great. I can take on f7, then I can take on a8. That is also bad. And let me just confirm why. So that is bad because black's king dips to c7, and here you're missing the forest for the trees, right? You can't just go after random material here. Look at white's king. You're just getting checkmated here. You have no pieces developed. Finally, queen takes d3 should be avoided, because after the trade, you just have an equal endgame, or maybe black is even slightly better. So instead, you need to make a ridiculously patient move. You need to realize that white has to bring pieces into the game as quickly as possible. In particular, the rook on a1 has to enter the game via d1. So you play a simple developing move. You play bishop e3. But this move should make perfect logical sense to you. You don't just want to take the knight on black's terms. You want to capture this knight with the rook so that white's knight remains on an optimal attacking square. The knight on d3 is going absolutely nowhere. It can't move because the queen is pinned, and after rook d1, it will be pinned to the king. So even if black moves the queen to a defended square, rook d1 pins the knight again, and this time you're capturing it on your terms. It's plus over minus according to the engine. It's +1, but black is in a lot of danger here. So because of this very simple line, how can you miss it? The key move being d6. My mistake was to play the move e5 here. I was too principled, right? I didn't sufficiently consider deviating from my strategy. Now, in my defense, well, after knight eg4, which I was expecting, the correct move would have been h3, and now, indeed, the best move is to play e5. But here the situation is completely different because the knights are super misplaced. So after knight c6, e5, knight g4 is correct, and the evaluation is indeed pretty dire for white. It's -3 almost. Bishop b2 is indeed the top move. So, ooh, yeah, we were completely lost at some point. I'll show you how black should have played. Very instructive indeed. Let's rewind really quickly to this position. I just want to show you what the main line is in this position. Now, the most popular move, according to the database, is e6. But here, white is solidly better. You go e5, you play f4, and you basically get a really good French, right? You go knight f3, bishop d3. White's quite clearly better here, even according to the engine. If d takes e4, then you push through d5. And after knight e5, f takes e4, this is a highly dangerous position for black. A lot of games here go e6, and now white simply continues developing with knight f3. And if you just blindly trade and go e takes d5, then there's this line bishop e5 check and e5. And black is in a lot of trouble here. Black is in a lot of trouble in this position. Because if he takes on b5, I'm pretty sure you play e takes f6, creating a threat against g7 and a threat against the bishop. And just in general, this is very, very risky for black. So these types of lines is what entices people to play the Boor. And this happens often at sort of the club player level. You can dig around here on your own. You can sort of pause the video, open up an engine, and if you really want to get to know these positions, you can just analyze on your own. But I don't want to talk about it too much. Still awake, but finishing very shortly. In any case, after e5, d5, knight e5, f4, we made a critical mistake. We played e5, and immediately I realized what I had done. I just completely forgot that this square existed. So bishop e2, bishop c5, excellent move by our opponent, understanding that bishop takes g4 is not dangerous because of queen h4 check and queen takes g4. And once again, very important to understand that just because the queens are off the board doesn't mean that in some sense your king is automatically safe or weak squares don't count. You can get checkmated here just as quickly as with the queens on the board. Hopefully that makes sense. So for example, let's say you play h3. Okay, not a big deal. The bishop can drop back, let's say to f5 or maybe even to e6. And black is on the verge of crashing through with a move like d4 or knight d4. There's too many weak squares in white's position. White is not able to hold on here. Knight b4 is very dangerous as well. Maybe the engine will find a way to survive, but for a human, this is virtually impossible. So for that reason, we decided to go the full 9 yards. I didn't see another move other than queen takes d5. So queen b6, bishop f2 check. This, I think, is a critical mistake. I think this move, as tempting as it looks, is a big mistake that gives white a new lease on life. I still think that black is better after this move, but I think the simplest was to play queen b6 immediately. Right? You want to save this move for a rainy day. You don't want to play it just because it's a check. Putting the bishop in close proximity to white's king actually makes things worse. That's what a lot of people don't realize about bishops. They are best as a long-range piece. And you don't want to, quote-unquote, move in before you're absolutely ready for it. So, for example, if white plays knight h3 here, which we probably would have done, I think the winning move is just knight d4. You just continue putting pieces in the center and continue creating threats, and white gets overwhelmed here. White's position is collapsing. It's the only way that I can describe it, is that white's position is collapsing here. Knight a4 is always met with queen a5 check. Knight a4 is never dangerous as long as the king remains on e1 because of the a5 e1 diagonal. Yeah, knight d4 is just destruction. And try to make a move here for white. You can't castle. Knight c2 is threatened. And I guess white can try bishop d1, but I think black can simply castle here. And white is totally paralyzed. She proposes knight e4 instead of knight h3. Knight e4 might be the best chance because bishop takes g1 would be a terrible mistake due to knight d6 check. Yeah, probably knight e4 is the best that white can do. But my guess is that bishop b4 check is probably the winning move. And after bishop d2, again, I think the simplest is to castle kingside. And by the way, moves like castles cause a lot of trouble for players. Like, finding moves like that is hard because when you're attacking, you often get into this frame of mind where you think that every single move needs to carry an obvious threat. But it's just as important to make moves that bring new troops into the game. Yeah, knight e4, I'm checking with the engine. Bishop b4 check. Bishop d2, castles is indeed winning. And same goes for king f1 in this position. The top engine move is just another developing move. Bishop f5, prepare to bring the rook into the game. Right, remember these types of moves. And don't assume that every move has to be a sacrifice or a check when you're attacking. White's king is going absolutely nowhere. You're not actually in a big rush. By the way, bishop f5 does create the threat of bishop takes e4 and queen f2 mate. So bishop f2 check, according to the engine, is, yeah, it's equal after that. After king f1, queen b6, knight h3, white is actually slightly better, which I think might be an exaggeration, but no, but the entire attack evaporates. That's how much of a mistake it is to play bishop f2 check. So after queen b6, the top engine line is indeed knight e4, bishop b4 check, king f1, bishop f5. Now white is supposed to play bishop takes g4, which, as we have already established, if you have to give up your light squared bishop, that is a terrible sign, because then you will have to permanently deal with the weakness of the light squares. Now, in order to stay alive, the only move is queen d3, rook d8, and bishop e3. And white has no choice but literally to give up a piece. Oh, but after rook d3, look at the engine. Looks like white is just down a piece for nothing. But the engine sees what really pretty defensive resource here. This is just crazy. I mean, once these moves are made, you should see this quickly. Once these moves are made, you should see this move quickly. Yeah, there's knight f2. There's knight f2. But here, black has the simple rook d4. You give up the bishop on your own terms. Rook takes f4 check, and knight takes e5. Black is a pawn up, and just look at the state of white's position. This is minus 3.5. This is technically winning, but not totally over. White is still somewhat kicking. So this is how the engine defends. Queen d3, rook d8, bishop e3. That's why no human would be able to survive this position for more than 2 moves, even at the top level. But these are the kinds of tricks you have to find if you want to stay alive in a position like this. So anyways, bishop f2 check spoils everything because it gives us the potential to play knight h3 with tempo. Every tempo is golden in positions like these. Every tempo is golden in position like these. And after knight e3 check, we are already winning with knight g5. The queen d3 idea indeed wins the game. Now what's interesting, if we fast forward a little bit, apologies for that, knight d3 check, bishop e3, we take over the initiative with knight g5. The best defense is counterattack. So remember the checklist. When you're defending, on the one hand, you're trying to make a list of the top priorities. What is the biggest threat? On the second hand, you're trying to figure out whether you have any realistic chances to start a counterattack with pieces that could be activated. Knight e3 check was a subsequent mistake. It's already plus over minus. The best move, according to the engine, is just to drop the bishop back, right? This is not glamorous, but it keeps the attack going. Now, after takes, knight g5 castles, what's hilarious is that queen d3 is indeed an inaccuracy. Queen e4 is much better. And the reason why is after queen d3, g6, knight d5. Now, our opponent's move loses immediately. Queen takes b2 was a lot more resilient. Now, after rook b1, let's see if anybody can find the most resilient move for black. It's still losing. It's still plus 3.5, but queen e4 would have been plus 6, and there's a specific reason for it. This isn't just some computer babble, Not queen d2. Not queen d2 because here knight takes e3 keeps everything protected, but you're close. Queen d4. Now, you might say, well, it's the same thing. It's just play knight takes e3, but there's queen takes f4 check. White keeps the extra piece with knight f3, but black is able to win another pawn. And all of a sudden, black has 2 pawns for the piece. Now, queen d4 is winning. White should be able to convert this pretty effortlessly. But queen e4 eliminates the need for all of that, because if you use the process of comparison, you just literally make the same moves. Queen takes b2, rook b1. Well, queen d4, now you have knight takes e3, and the f4 pawn is not hanging. Right, so most of the time that you have 2 candidate moves that look very similar, the best thing you can do is just to compare them by examining the same variation, going down the line, and figuring out how one move, impacts the position versus the other move. So I actually gave a student an example of that exact thing earlier today. If you guys are interested, I can show you a good example of using the process of comparison to distinguish between 2 tempting candidate moves that both look like they do the same thing. It's white to play here. And the goal is for white to win the game. It's a complicated position. The goal for white is to win the game. White wins with only 1 accurate move. Everything else is either a draw or a loss. Now, how do we even begin to approach such a position? Well, we need to get our bearings, right? We need to get our bearings by figuring out how white is even going to try to surmount the loss of a piece. We're down a piece. Well, if you look at this for a couple of moments, you should see an idea, right? The idea is to force a rook trade. And if black has only 1 rook on the 8th rank, then we will be able to overwhelm that rook with our pawns and with our other rook. So the 2 ideas that immediately come to mind are rook a b1 and rook a c1. The ideas are exactly the same. We want to go rook c8 and we want to go rook b8. So for example, let's start with the move rook a b1. If black makes an empty move, such as knight f6 or something, then we want to go rook b8. Obviously, if black takes twice, then we promote, and this is checkmate. And if black does not act, right, if black does nothing, then, well, it's easy. We play rook takes a8, we play d8 queen. One way or another, we're going to overwhelm black's forces with only a rook. But now we start looking for defensive resources. And after rook a b1, we need to ask ourselves, well, can black use the knight in order to somehow disrupt the coordination of white's rooks? So who can answer that question? What can black try to distract white's attention from the threat of rook b8? Well, there's the move knight e3. Right? There's the move knight e3. It attacks the rook. And I said, well, there's not a problem, right? If you go rook b8 now, black plays knight takes d1 and wins. We don't have enough pieces. So clearly, we have to preserve this rook. And we probably have to keep it on the d file. So, well, the simplest seems to be rook d2. The simplest seems to be rook d2, because if we go rook d3, if we go rook d4, we blunder the rook. If we go rook d3, then black continues to harass us with e4. But this is where process of comparison comes in. Let's ingrain this position in your mind. We are comparing this position and this position. And there is one key difference that, if you detect, allows you to distinguish between these two moves. Who can tell me what this difference is? Why do you need to keep it on the d file? Well, we need to keep the d7 pawn protected. Exactly. After rook d2, black does not have the key resource knight c4 attacking the rook. Why is that resource dangerous? Well, if we go rook b1, knight e3, rook d2, knight c4, again we have to move our rook. And after we move it, the knight jumps back to d6, intercepting the rook and the pawn, and black wins. Because rook b8 is no longer effective. Black is now able to capture twice on b8. And if white does nothing, then black takes on d7 on the next move. So the move is rook a c1. After knight e3, we go rook d2. And black is not in time. Knight f5, rook c8, knight d6 here doesn't work by a tempo. Takes, rook b2, and rook b8 is unstoppable. So nothing insane. I mean, this is more of a technical calculation exercise. By the way, knight f6 here. There's a pretty line. You go rook c8. Black takes twice. You play rook b1, aiming for b8. Black has one more defense, knight d7, and now we go rook b7. Just the domination of a rook and two pawns against the entire army. The knight is hanging, and if the knight moves, you go rook b8. If the knight is not moved, then you take the knight, you come back to b7, and then you go to b8. The king is completely confined by this deadly pawn on g6. Why is rook db1 not winning? So rook db1 is not winning. It's a good question. I think it's not winning because of knight f6. Rook b8 does not come with the same effect as rook b8 if the rook's on d1. Right? The rook on a1 is a lot worse than the rook on d1, because here black can play rook to b8 and rook takes b8. If the rook was on d1 here, then promoting would be made. Here you have no equivalent, right? Again, process of comparison. So for that reason, rook db1 is not as effective as rook ab1. If black takes the a7 pawn, you go rook b8. This is the main point, right? You want to go rook b8 to distract black's rook. The a7 pawn has nothing to do with it, right? It's only good insofar as it forces black to give away one of his rooks. The g6 pawn is worth its weight in gold, yeah. But not to spend too long on this, the point is that you use comparison, you look at both lines simultaneously, and you try to figure out, like, do you control a certain square in one of the lines? Do you prevent an option? That is one of the hardest tools to properly apply, but it's incredibly important. So just wanted to sort of introduce you to it, even if it's hard. The starting position is winning. Yeah, the whole point is that rook ac1 wins the game, but rook ab1 does not. It actually only draws. So back to the game. I think after bishop f5, queen takes c3, we can stop here because the rest was obvious. King f2. And had I noticed queen c3, we would have played it here. I just didn't notice this move, to be honest. I fell for, I was too focused on defending the rook. But once we saw queen c3, we played it because this forced the queen trade, and black resigned because obviously we're simply up a full piece here. So only 20 moves, but nonetheless a very rich game, both opening-wise and I think in terms of the early middle game. So the lesson here is, again, I misevaluated e5. I was too focused on trying to evaluate d4. This is a common thing that happens when you spend a lot of time trying to evaluate one particular move. You often forget to go back to the initial position and make sure that you've examined the other candidate moves properly. I'm sure you guys can relate to this, right? You spend 5-10 minutes poring over a line. It turns out the line works out for you, so you get excited, so you play the move, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, I didn't check the other variations properly. So as I was mentioning during the game, I spent some time trying to evaluate this endgame, BC, GF. I thought that white is slightly better here because our development is a little bit more efficient. We go bishop e3, and then we castle queenside. I also evaluated knight e4, and I thought, okay, we trade queens, and I think white is reasonably better in this endgame. But I completely forgot that knight e4 and d4 are not the only moves. Black can keep the initiative with knight g4. Very instructive, I think, very instructive moment. And the ability to be flexible, right? The ability to go for a line or move with one idea, but based on your opponent's reaction, to stop on a dime and change your approach. This is a good example of that. My idea in playing f4 was obviously to follow up with e5. But after knight c6, I should have taken this move and updated my perception of the board and realized that e takes d5 is now the correct way to go. Of course, I would have had to see the move d6, which I missed. But such is life. This is what you have to notice in complicated positions. Any questions? Thank you, everybody. And I will see y'all later.